Reports are emerging that a rift is widening amid growing tension between Prince Harry and King Charles.
The air in the private study at Windsor Castle was suffocating, heavy with the scent of aged parchment and the unspoken weight of a decision that would echo through history. King Charles sat behind his mahogany desk, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the document that lay before him. It was a formal plea, a final, desperate attempt by Prince Harry to negotiate the impossible. Outside the heavy oak doors, the world moved on, unaware that in these quiet, private minutes, the structure of the British monarchy was undergoing a seismic shift. The king knew that the moment he moved his hand to approve the draft, the bridge between him and his youngest son would be burned not by fire, but by the cold, unyielding reality of institutional duty. Harry's plea had arrived without ceremony, delivered through channels that had once been open but now felt cold and distant. The contents were familiar, a repetition of demands that had fueled years of media storms, public accusations, and private heartbreak. Yet, as Charles read the handwritten lines regarding his grandchildren, Archie and Lilibet, he felt a sharp, piercing pain. He read the words twice, his brow furrowing as he processed the implications. The request was not merely about titles. It was about defining the Sussex's place in a future where they had clearly chosen to walk away from the very institution that granted them those identities. The Duke and Duchess of Sussex titles were not simply names. They were royal dignities, symbols of authority granted by the crown, linking Harry and Meghan to the heart of the institution. Removing them would not be a mere administrative act. It would sever the final, formal cord connecting them to palace life. Charles held his hand over the paper, as if he could physically suppress the consequences of his next move. He had spent months oscillating between the anger of a father and the responsibility of a monarch. He had expected Harry to understand the boundaries. Yet the plea suggested a misunderstanding of what a title truly represented in the eyes of the crown. As he stared at the desk, he recalled the laughter that once filled these halls, a sound now replaced by the chilling silence of estrangement. The decision to strip the titles was not born from a desire for revenge, but from a necessity to protect the monarchy from the ongoing, corrosive effects of the Sussex's public grievances. Harry, meanwhile, waited in the distance, his mind filled with a belief he could not admit aloud. He hoped, perhaps naively, that his father would separate the pain of the family from the punishment of the institution. He braced himself for anger, perhaps even conditions or warnings, but he clung to the hope that Charles would delay the announcement, perhaps citing the children or a future window for reconciliation. But as the clock ticked, the hope began to collapse. The reply that eventually arrived offered no such comfort. It was a rejection colder than anything Harry had prepared for. It was a message stating that the dispute had reached a point beyond reconciliation, transforming from a family matter into a matter of institutional survival. Inside the palace, the machinery of the monarchy was already in motion. A palace secretary entered, carrying the final version of the statement. The wording had been approved by the king, and the release time was set in stone. Though Harry's plea had reached the king before the final publication, the gears of the palace had begun turning long before. Charles could have stopped it, could have offered a stay of execution for the titles, but he chose not to. He understood that to delay any further would be to project weakness at a time when the monarchy needed to project stability. He watched the secretary walk out, the footsteps echoing like the closing of a tomb. In his own home, miles away, Harry read the rejection in silence. Meghan watched his expression, the subtle shifts from expectation to crushing realization. Before he even spoke the words, she understood that the titles were gone. He did not shout. He did not rage. He simply stared at the final line of the message, where his father had made it clear that this decision was permanent. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the hum of the electronic devices that kept them connected to a world that was about to see them differently. Beneath that verdict lay an even deeper wound. Harry did not know who had spoken the words that had carried the most weight. He wondered if his brother, William, had been the one to insist on the finality of the decision, or if it was the collective weight of the institution itself that had finally decided to shut the door. For Charles, this was a test of his reign. Could a king protect the monarchy without destroying the last fragments of his relationship with his youngest son? For Harry, The news was definitive proof that the path back had been sealed. For Meghan, watching from across the ocean, the decision carried a brutal, unspoken message. The palace was no longer entertaining the idea of their departure as a temporary phase. It was a permanent separation. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the rooms of the palace, Charles remained seated. He looked toward an empty chair, the one where his son had once sat, debated, and laughed. The crown was preserved, the authority was intact, but the price, he feared, would be the permanent loss of his son. To understand why Charles refused even his son's final appeal, the story must return to the private gathering where Harry crossed the line the palace had warned him never to approach. For months, the palace had tolerated criticism, television interviews, accusations, and public humiliation, yet none of those moments alone triggered the removal of the Sussex titles. The true point of no return came during a private Windsor reconciliation meeting, a gathering meant to separate family healing from royal status. Harry had walked into that room carrying years of unreleased anger, placing a list of demands before Charles and William, insisting that continued access, ceremonial recognition, and security guarantees were the absolute price of peace. The room had tightened the moment Harry stated his condition. He told his father and brother that there could be no peace unless he and Meghan received ceremonial recognition, guaranteed security, and access to royal events on terms they helped define. William had pushed his chair back sharply, asking whether family contact was now being offered as part of a cold bargain. Harry denied threatening anyone, but the words hung heavily between them. Then came the sentence that changed the atmosphere completely. Harry's proposal demanded that the Sussex titles be permanently protected from any future review, even if he and Meghan never resumed royal duties. A royal dignity is an honor granted through the sovereign, carrying public authority because it comes from the crown. To William, making the titles permanently untouchable would separate privilege from responsibility. To Charles, it turned a wounded son's request into a direct and dangerous test of royal control. Harry had gathered the papers after his father refused to answer immediately, leaving the room under the belief that silence meant hesitation. Instead, the moment the heavy doors closed, Charles turned toward William and instructed that the constitutional file governing royal dignities be brought to him. That evening, the secret review began, laying the groundwork for a confrontation far more painful than anything that had come before. Charles offered Harry one final private audience, an encounter where father and son would face each other without advisors, lawyers, or cameras. No courtiers sat between them to soften the blow. Charles and Harry stood face to face, but the presence of the crown was felt in every heavy silence. Harry asked whether the king truly intended to erase the title given to him on his wedding day, arguing that it struck at the heart of his identity. Charles answered with a sorrowful firmness, explaining that no one was erasing his personal identity, but delivering the verdict that ended the argument. Harry could not reject the responsibilities of royal life while demanding permanent ownership of its authority. Leaning forward, refusing to accept the boundary, Harry accused his father of prioritizing William's future and treating every decision as a tool to protect the heir while punishing the spare. Charles gripped the arm of his chair, refusing to raise his voice, stating quietly that true love could not mean surrendering every institutional boundary simply because his younger son felt shut out. The tension peaked when Harry made one final plea, asking that Meghan at least retain her Duchess title even if his own was taken. Charles shook his head, knowing the refusal would wound them both deeply, but realizing that preserving one title would leave the fundamental contradiction untouched and invite another bitter fight almost immediately. Her title existed through the same royal grant as his, and the king refused to split a single constitutional decision into two separate exceptions. Harry rose slowly, believing William had driven the entire process from behind the scenes. Yet the reality was far more complex. An alliance had quietly formed inside the family, uniting Charles, William, and Princess and around a single, unbreakable conclusion. Behind the palace walls, the three senior royals had reached an uneasy agreement. Charles wanted stability, William demanded consistency, and Princess warned that continued hesitation would weaken every future boundary of the crown. When they reviewed the Windsor notes, and argued with cold precision that precedent would outlive them all. If status remained untouched without duty, future generations would inherit endless confusion over where privilege ended and service began. Charles listened from the window, admitting that signing the authorization might cost him his son completely, yet William and reminded him that uncertainty was already harming everyone. The king finally signed the order, adding one crucial instruction in his own hand. The public announcement must not insult Harry, Meghan, Archie, or Lilibet. The ruling was fixed, but the human cost was only just beginning. By sunrise, the decision was no longer private, constitutional, or carefully controlled. It belonged entirely to the public. Broadcasters interrupted their scheduled programming, commentators argued fiercely over loyalty and punishment, and crowds gathered outside Buckingham Palace beneath a sky of flashing screens and breaking news banners. One major newspaper captured the entire crisis in 4 stark words printed across its front page. "The Crown chooses duty." Beneath the bold headline appeared 2 haunting photographs. Charles sitting alone at his desk, and Harry stepping out of a car with his eyes lowered toward the ground. The contrast was immediate, transforming a quiet palace verdict into a global spectacle where strangers debated a father and son's pain as though it belonged to everyone. Charles watched the morning broadcasts in silence. The news anchors described the moment as the most complete royal separation since Harry and Meghan stepped away from official duties, noting that while the couple had previously kept a public connection to the crown through their titles, that bridge was now completely severed. Palace staff repeated a single official line, calling it constitutional clarity, a formal attempt to make status match responsibility rather than an act of personal revenge. Yet, to Charles, the words still sounded deeply personal. When a television presenter described the scene as a father formally closing the door on his son, the king reached for the remote and turned off the television before the segment could finish, sitting alone in the quiet room with the heavy weight of his choice. Across the ocean, Harry watched clips of the crowds outside Buckingham Palace, where some signs praised the king's defense of duty while others accused the monarchy of cruelty. His private plea had become public judgment, and television networks continuously cut from the breaking statements to footage of Harry and Meghan's wedding day. The juxtaposition was brutal. A day once presented to the world as a symbol of modern renewal was now replayed beside language declaring that the Sussex titles were gone forever. Meghan watched the sequence once before looking away, while Harry stayed fixed on the screen, listening to cheers from the past collide with condemnation in the present. The anger that had briefly sustained him gave way to a hollow, exhausting realization that the life he once belonged to had firmly closed its doors. William refused to treat the outcome as a victory, strictly instructing his staff not to brief against his brother or feed hostile details to journalists. The future king understood that while finality was necessary to protect the institution, triumph would only deepen a wound that was already bleeding. Yet, despite the efforts to avoid a public circus, the noise outside the palace gates grew louder, turning into a stage for anger, loyalty, grief, and blame. Neither the flashing cameras nor the endless commentary could answer the quiet emptiness waiting inside the family. For the first time, public certainty exposed the profound private void that language had failed to hide from either man, leaving Charles and Harry with no titles left to debate and no officials left to blame. In the final analysis, there was no dramatic reversal, no hidden compromise, and no secret restoration waiting behind another palace door. The Sussex titles were gone. Charles remained firm in his constitutional duty. William accepted the burdensome reality of supporting the verdict, and Harry was forced to confront a future entirely unprotected by royal status. The final meaning of the moment was not simply that a king had defeated a rebellious son, but that the monarchy had chosen absolute certainty, knowing fully that certainty would carry a deeply human price. Before sealing the final files for good, Charles opened the folder one last time, looking at the records of formal styles and official references that had been permanently altered. He did not destroy his son's original plea. Instead, he folded it carefully and placed it inside a private drawer, preserving the words beneath the dispute and the child beneath the anger. The crown stood firmer. The father sat alone with the cost, and history recorded the undeniable truth of a king who chose duty even when the price was his own son.